Hello everyone, welcome to GoVMlab. In this lecture, we are going to learn about how do we go and create our very first distributed switch in vSphere environment. Now, what is distributed switch? A vSphere distributed switch provides centralized management and monitoring of the networking configuration of all those hosts that are associated or managed by that switch. We can set up a distributed switch on a vCenter server system and all of its networking configurations are being propagated to all those hosts that are managed by with that switch. So distributed switch is a centralized switch which really simplifies networking configurations and management in vSphere environment. So now with that, let's get started. Now, as you could see that we are logged into our vCenter server named as savcsa01.govmlab.local. And if you do see that we are running a version 7.0. Now let's go and browse our vCenter server. Within that vCenter server, we do see a data center created named as SA data center. Let's go and browse our data center. Within that data center, we do see a cluster created named as SA cluster. Let's go and browse our cluster. Within that cluster, we do see that there are 3 ESXi hosts added to this cluster, and we do have bunch of VMs which are running on that cluster. So that's our vSphere environment. Now let's try to have a quick look at our vSphere networking configuration. So let's check out any of the one host of our cluster. So let's click on our SA ESXi01 host, click on configure, click on networking to have a quick view of the network configuration of that host. Click on virtual switches and look at that. If you do see that our host have only standard switch created. We don't have any distributed switch created on that particular host, or we don't have any distributed switch which is managing this particular host networking. Now we have a standard switch created named as vSwitch 0, and if you do see that there are 3 port groups created on this standard switch. This is the first port group, which is our management network port group. This is the third port group, which is a vMotion port group taking care of our vMotion network. And if you do see that it has a VM kernel NIC. What does that mean? These are VM kernel port group. And the second port group, what do you see that named as VM network? This is the port group which is defined for our virtual machine traffic. And if you go and browse that particular port group, you will see that there are 2 virtual machine net server VM and prod VM01 is connected to VM network port group, which is a virtual machine port group of this specific switch. Now, if you look at the other 2 port group, you do see that there is no virtual machine connected to it, as you rightly see that. And I hope you are aware about the concept of VM kernel port group and virtual machine port group. And that's where these 2 port group, VMK0 and VMK1, these 2 are VM kernel network adapter, are taking care of the VM kernel traffic. So that's how our standard switch looks like. And if you do see that, this is our switch pictorial representation, and this particular green icon, what you see that it is referring to the switch ports. So that's what it's referring to, the switch ports. And on the right side, you do see that that's our physical adapter. Physical adapter means our VM NIC, or that's a physical adapter which is installed in our ESXi host, providing us network connectivity. And if you do see that there is only one network adapter named as VMNIC 0 is actually connected to this virtual switch 0 and providing external networking connectivity. Now, if you look at the other host, you will see the identical configuration. So other hosts also have only standard switch named as vSwitch 0 created on it. And we do see the similar port groups there. This is a management network, that's a vMotion network, and the middle one what we have, it is the VM network port group, and it also has a one adapter VMNIC 0 connected to the vSwitch 0 to provide external network connectivity. Let's look at the third host, and if you do see that the third host is also having the identical network configuration. So now all of these hosts are having a standard switch created to manage all the network configuration of these specific hosts. Now what we are going to do in this particular lecture, we are going to create our very first distributed switch, and we are going to walk you through the step-by-step configuration of vSphere distributed switch in vSphere 7.0 environment. So now before we go and get started with our distributed switch configuration, the very important thing we should be remembering that we should be having a spare physical adapters on each of our ESXi hosts, which we would like to get managed through the distributed switch. So let's have a quick view of our physical adapters which are present on each of these ESXi hosts before we go and get started with our distributed switch creation. So now if you do see that That's where we have an option called physical adapters. So click on physical adapters and you do see that there are 4 adapters which are present on our SA ESXi 03 host, as you rightly see it here. And if you do see that the very first adapter VMlink 0 is being claimed by Virtual Switch 0, but we do have 3 adapters which are not being claimed by any virtual switch. So now we have a spare physical adapter which can be claimed by our distributed switch. So we are pretty good from the configuration perspective. Let's verify the same thing for the other 2 hosts as well. So other 2 hosts is also having 4 network adapters, and the very first adapter is being claimed by vSwitch 0, and we do have 3 adapters which are available on our SA ESXi 02 host. Click on SA ESXi 01 host and we do see that the configurations are exact identical on the ESXi01 host as well, and we do have 3 adapters which are not being claimed by any switch. So now we can make use of any of these adapters for our distributed switch configuration. So now we are pretty good from the configuration perspective. Let's go and get started with our distributed switch creation. Now, as we have discussed that distributed switch is a centralized switch and it can only be created and managed at the vCenter server level. So we cannot go and create distributed switch at every host level. So now to create a distributed switch, what we have to do, let's go to the networking icon of our vCenter inventory. So let's click on this networking icon to browse through our network configuration. So click on networking, click here to browse our data center. As you could see that there is only one port group what is created as of now, and that port group name is VM network. And if you remember what is that VM network port group, that is the virtual machine network port group. So if you click on that VM network port group, it will give you the information that there are 8 virtual machines which are connected to this port group, and there are 3 hosts on which this particular port group has been created. Now what are these hosts? Click on that host and it will give you detail about these 3 hosts, as you rightly see it here. And if you click on VMs, it will give you all those details about VMs which are connected to this VM network port group. So that's what this particular VM network port group is all about it. And this particular VM network port group is aligned with our standard switch. It has nothing to do with the vSphere distributed switch because we have not created any vSphere distributed switch so far in our vSphere environment. So now let's go and create our very first distributed switch. So how do we go and create our distributed switch? Click on data center, right click on it, and that's where you will find an option called distributed switch. So click on the distributed switch. Now when you click on distributed switch, that's where we have an option called new distributed switch. So click on new distributed switch, and now it will prompt us to the very first option where it asks for name of the distributed switch, what name we want to give it to our distributed switch, and the location it already predefines as SA data center because we actually trying to create this distributed switch on that SA data center. So now let's give a name to our distributed switch. I'm going to give a name as VDS site A. Click on next. The next section talks about define the version of our distributed switch because VMware has a every release VMware is keep updating their distributed switch configurations, enhancements, and that's where it is asking that which particular version of distributed switch we would like to get it created. So now if you do see that, what is the difference between 7.0, 6.6.0 and 6.5.0 version? Now before we go and understand the differences between these 3 versions, please remember that distributed switch version has nothing to do with the vSphere version. What does that mean? It means that 7.0 is the version of distributed switch. 6.5 is the version of distributed switch. Now we do have a similar version for vSphere or ESXi as well, like ESXi 7.0 as you rightly see it here, or we do have a ESXi 6.5 version. But if you do see that there is a VDS version called 6.6.0, but the relevant ESXi version is 6.7. So we don't have any ESXi 6.6 version. So please remember that ESXi versioning is different than VDS versioning. Right now, what is the difference between these 3 versioning? Click on this particular information icon and it will give you the feature details and enhancement details. So as you could see that distributed switch 7.0 has a support for NSX distributed port group. So now if you are aware about NSX product, NSX now has a support for VDS configurations as well. But to have NSX support for VDS, you need to have a VDS version 7.0. You can't have a NSX capabilities on VDS version 6.6.0. Now, The 6.6.0 version has a new feature or enhancement for the Mac learning feature. So it gives you capability of Mac learning. And if you look at the 6.5.0 version of the distributed switch, it gives you port mirroring enhancement. So that's the basic difference between 7.0, 6.6.0 and 6.5.0 version of vSphere distributed switch. So now let's go and so now we are going to go ahead with the version 7.0 because we are already running 7.0 version on our ESXi host. So let's go with the latest version of our distributed switch, which is 7.0.0. Click on next. Now here we need to define some kind of configuration details for our distributed switch. Now the very first option asks about number of uplink. Now if you remember, even if it's a standard switch, we always go and define the uplink. And if we have looked at the configuration, every standard switch what we had created on each of these ESXi hosts was having a one uplink connected to it, and that uplink was VMNIC 0. So that's where it is asking that in the distributed switch, how many uplinks do we want to create it? So these uplinks are just a logical uplinks. They are not mapped with any physical adapter as of now. We are just creating a placeholder for those uplinks, and these uplinks are considered as a DV uplinks. So let's say we are just want to create two uplinks at the distributed switch level as of now. The next option talks about network IO control. So do we want to enable network IO control capabilities on our vSphere distributed switch? Yes or no? Now network IO control is one of the very powerful feature which gives us a better control on network bandwidth distribution whenever we have a contention at the adapter level. And that's where we define reservation shares and limits parameters to maintain and to prioritize the network traffic. Now, network IO control is the feature which is only available in the vSphere distributed switch. We don't find this feature in the standard switch. So as of now, by default, if you do see that, that feature is enabled. But if you want, you can disable that feature as well. So as of now, we will just enable that feature as a default configuration. Now, the next option says that default port group. What this configuration settings asking for us that do we want to create a default port group or not? If you want to create a default port group, then as soon as the switch will be created, a new port group will be created. So now let's go with the default port group because we want a port group to be created on our distributed switch. So let's enable this particular option of creating a default port group. Now let's move on to the next option. It says that what is your port group name? So if you do see that, if I uncheck this option, I don't find this option to define the port group name. But as soon as I select this option, because I want a port group to be created, as soon as my distributed switch gets created, then it is asking us what is the name of the port group you want to create it. So we want to create a port group name as DVPG VM network. So we are creating a port group DVPG VM network. Click on next. Now here we can, now this is the wizard where we can review our distributed switch configuration. So let's review our distributed switch configuration. We are going to create a distributed switch named as VDS site A. The version of our distributed switch is 7.0. The number of uplinks we are going to define as 2. Network IO control is enabled by default on our distributed switch, and we also want to create a default port group on our distributed switch with the name as DVPGVM network. One of the very important thing to remember that we are not done yet once you click on finish, because if you look at this option, it says that suggested next actions. The next action says that we have to create a new distributed port group based on our business requirement. But most important thing, we also need to add and manage host. What will I do just by creating a distributed switch if I don't add host to that particular distributed switch? So that's the next step. What we are going to do after creating our distributed switch is we are going to add host to our distributed switch. So now everything looks good from the distributed switch configuration perspective. Now click on finish, click on task pane. As you could see that we have successfully created our very first distributed switch. And now let's minimize this task pane and look at that. That is the distributed switch what we had created. Now let's go and browse our distributed switch. And if you browse our distributed switch, you do see that there are two port groups which are created on our distributed switch. The very first port group name is DVPG VM network. And if you remember, that is the default port group name what we had provided at the time of distributed switch configuration. And if you do see that there is another port group what has created, and you might be wondering from where this port group is coming, because we have not defined any port group name for this particular port group. And that is a DV uplink port group. It's a well-defined DV uplink port group which gets created as a part of distributed switch creation itself. And we don't need to provide any customized name for this particular DV uplink port group. It's a system defined port group created at the time of distributed switch creation itself. Now let's go and click on our distributed switch, and you do see that that's a version 7.0.0 version, and it tells us that IO control is enabled on our distributed switch. And in this section, you will get the details about your distributed switch. Now, what all the details you will get it? It says that there are two networks have been created on this distributed switch. What are these two networks? It is referring to these two networks, DVPG-VM network and DV uplink port group. Now, if you look at that, it says that there are no hosts have been managed or assigned to this distributed switch. That's very well connect. That's correct. We have not add any host to this distributed switch. That's the next thing what we will be doing it. If you look at the virtual machine, as of now, there are no virtual machines which are being assigned to this distributed switch because all of our virtual machines are still connected to our VM network port group. We have to migrate our virtual machines to distributed switch. That we will be doing in the next lecture. If you look at the ports, it is telling us that this distributed switch is configured with the 8 DV ports, because distributed switch is just like your physical switch, and just like your physical switch, it will be having its own ports. Now, if you want to get about detail about those ports, click on that port section and look at that. This is what it is referring to, 8 ports. So it starts with the numbering 0, as you rightly see that, and it's end with the number 7. So total number of ports are 8, and that's where it was showing us the total number of ports are 8. Now, if you look at that particular port, as of now, none of the port has been claimed by any of the entity because we have not done with the distributed switch configuration. As of now, we just have created a distributed switch. We have not managed or add our host to distributed switch. We have not migrated our VMs to distributed switch, and we have not even assigned a uplink to our distributed switch. And that is the reason, as of now, all of these ports are blank or not being claimed by any of the entity. Now let's click on the summary section again. The next section about the features, it will give us information about the features, what all the features are supported on this distributed switch. So as you could see that network IO control is supported. NetFlow feature is also supported on distributed switch. Link layer discovery protocol, link aggregation control protocol, port mirroring, IGMP snooping, and health check feature. These are the advanced features which are supported on this distributed switch. Now click on monitor section. In the monitor section, you will see that all the issues and alarms, just like every other vCenter inventory object, whether it's a VM, ESXi host, we have a provision for issues and alarms. Similarly, any issue which is specific to vSphere distributed switch, that issue will be prompted, that issue will be reported right there in this monitoring wizard, and that's where you can see all of the vSphere distributed switch related issues in this particular sections. Triggered alarms, any VDS specific alarms will be triggered and will be reported in this particular section. The task, as you could see that whatever the task we are performing on that distributed switch, we can get that details right there in the task pane. If you do see that in the task pane, it tells us that we are trying to create a distributed switch VDS site A, and it has created distributed port group and updated network IO control configuration as a part of VDS creation. In the events, you will find that what all the events have been triggered. So all those events related to distributed switch can be found right there in the event section. So now, as you could see that the very first event says that new ports were created in our distributed switch VDS site A, which is present under SA data center. And what was that task? Adding a distributed port groups. Similarly, if you keep clicking on other events, you will get to know about information about all these events. And the health section, you will get to know about the health check feature. So health check feature is a feature which is very specific to distributed switch. We don't find health check feature in the standard switch, and we will be discussing about health check feature much more in detail in the subsequent lectures. The next what we have it is the configure. So if you do see that in the distributed switch, the very first option what we have it about the properties. So it is actually giving us information about that distributed switch properties, such as what is the name of that switch, manufacturer details, versioning, uplinks, number of ports, and the network IO control is enabled or not. The next section talks about the MTU details. So our distributed switch by default is configured with 1500 bytes. The next section talks about the discovery protocol, whether it's a CDP protocol or it is your link layer discovery protocol. So as you could see that currently CDP protocol is enabled on our distributed switch, and our switch is configured in the listen mode. And the next what we have it is the administrator contact and other details. Now click on the topology. That's another very important section of our distributed switch, which actually gives us a pictorial representation of vSphere distributed switch. So as of now, if you do see that, that's a very basic switch what we have created without creating a very complex network configuration. But topology section of distributed switch will give us a very good pictorial representation of our vSphere distributed switch. And if you do see that, this is the representation of our distributed switch, and it tells us that we just have created as of now one DVPG port group named as DVPG VM network, and as of now there are no virtual machines which are mapped or assigned to this DVPG virtual machine network port group. The other port group, what do we have it, is the DV uplink port group, and there are two DV uplinks what we had created as at the time of VDS creation. But if you do see that, the network adapter count is 0, which means that we have not assigned any physical uplink as of now to this distributed switch. It's just a logical container what we have created at the time of VDS creation. So in the subsequent lecture, we will be actually going and configuring all of the required configuration of our distributed switch to be in functioning state. Now the next is LSCP. So LSCP is another a unique capability of our distributed switch which was not there in the vSphere standard switch. We will be having a dedicated lecture where we'll be discussing about LSCP configuration much more in detail. The next what we have it is a private VLAN. It's called PVLAN. PVLAN is again a feature which is very specific to vSphere distributed switch. We will be discussing about PVLAN feature much more in detail in a dedicated lecture. The next what we have it is the NetFlow. Again, NetFlow is a capability of vSphere distributed switch. We will be discussing about NetFlow much more in detail in the subsequent lecture. So as you could see that the distributed switch has a lot more capabilities than our vSphere standard switch. The next feature what we have it is the port mirroring. Port mirroring, we have a dedicated lecture where we'll be discussing about different type of port mirroring sessions. So if you click on the new, you will see that there are multiple port mirroring types are present. Distributed port mirroring, remote mirroring source, remote mirroring destination, encapsulated remote mirroring source. So we'll be discussing about all these port mirroring capabilities in the port mirroring lecture. The next what we have it is a health check. Health check is again a very powerful. We will be discussing about health check feature in the subsequent lectures. Now the next what we have it is the resource allocation. So resource allocation is what our network IO control, and network IO control, as you do see that one of the very important and the most important feature of our vSphere distributed switch, and we will be having a dedicated lecture where we go in depth about our network IO control feature of vSphere distributed switch, and we will be deep diving into this distributed switch capabilities. So now the next what we have it is a permission. So that's all about how do we go and define the permissions for the user. The next what we have it is the ports. So that will give you a lot more detailed information about all of the distributed switch ports and what all the entities which are mapped to that particular port, or what all those entities which are consuming the ports of distributed switch. The next what we have it is the host. What all the hosts are being managed by this distributed switch. We will be getting all that information in this particular sections. Click on VMs. So what all the VMs are being managed by this distributed switch would be getting populated in this particular section. As of now, we have not added any host to our distributed switch. Any VM has been assigned to our distributed switch. That is the reason we don't see any information getting populated here. But in the next lecture, we are going to add host and migrate our virtual machines from standard switch to distributed switch. And that's where we'll see that all these information about host and VM gets populated in this particular section. The last what we have it is the networks. So click on networks, and that would be giving information about all of the distributed port groups what we have created on our vSphere distributed switch. And as you do see that currently we have just created one distributed port group, that's a VM network port group. The VLAN ID is being assigned as 0, and you do see that the port binding is static binding and the number of ports are 8. So that's what our distributed port group is all about it. So this concludes our lecture on creating vSphere distributed switch, and we have walked you through the step-by-step procedure of how do we go and create our very first vSphere distributed switch in vCenter server. We hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thanks for your time.